This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news compiled in the early hours of Saturday the 16th of December. I'm Julian Keane with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, a post-election coalition deal in Austria, which could make it the only Western European country with a far-right party in government.
It was important for us to establish a new political style in dealing with one another in Austria, and I believe we succeeded in doing that during these negotiations.
We'll hear from Vienna. Also, a damning assessment of poverty in the United States.
There are 40 million people in the United States who are living below the poverty line, and that's a stunning number in one of the world's wealthiest countries, where a decision is currently being taken to transfer $1 or $1.5 billion to the wealthiest.
The Christians in Egypt forgiving the jihadists who murder.
Our religion teaches us to forgive. It teaches us to love our enemies, bless those who curse us, and to pray for those who hurt us.
And
to get from Johannesburg to Pretoria, it's about a 40-mile drive, but it takes almost 3 hours. So if you're in rush hour, you're spending 6 hours of the day parked in traffic. With this, you'd be there in 20 minutes or less.
Get ready for the flying car. But first, 2 months on from elections there, Austria is set to have a new government. It's expected to be a coalition made up of the People's Party, which came first, and the smaller anti-immigration Freedom Party, which could become the only far-right movement in Western Europe to be in government. The People's Party leader, Sebastian Kurz, said Austrians had voted for a change which would be delivered.
It
was important for us to establish a new political style in dealing with one another in Austria. Our aims are quite clear. We want to ease the burden on the taxpayers. We want to strengthen our standard, also to secure our social system. And above all, we want to make our country safer, also through the fight against illegal immigration.
Our correspondent Bethany Bell told me more from Vienna.
We know that there have been fights during the negotiation period over questions about Europe, for one thing. The Freedom Party has traditionally been more Eurosceptical. The Sebastian Kurz, under the Conservatives, has promised to form an EU-friendly government. And I think a lot of Austrians are sort of waiting to see who has the upper hand here. The Conservatives have said that they will try and rein in the excesses of the Freedom Party, if you like. Other people would say, well, actually, they've just taken on Freedom Party policies, particularly when it comes to migrants. And I presume we'll maybe get a clearer idea of, as you're saying, who has the upper hand when we see how the ministries will be divvied up. Yes, I mean, the understanding is that the Freedom Party will have several key posts. I've seen reports in the media, unconfirmed, saying that they may get the Interior Ministry, they may get the Defence Ministry, and also the Foreign Ministry as well. So these are very key ministries that they may be about to get. There was a lot of talk as well before this announcement was made this evening that they were going to block newcomers from accessing many social services in Austria until they'd been here for 5 years. They were going to cut benefits for refugees. So it will be very interesting to see quite how this pans out. They're going to meet tomorrow with Austria's President, Alexander van der Bellen, and then they'll meet with their two respective parties. And if all goes according to plan, they could be sworn in on Monday. It needs, though, the President still to sign this off. It needs the President to sign it off, and he has traditionally been very, very sceptical of the Freedom Party, and he sort of said in the past that he might block certain members of the Freedom Party from joining government. We don't know who the ministers are yet, so we'll have to see what his reaction is tomorrow. Bethany Bell. A senior United Nations official has given a damning assessment of the huge disparities between rich and poor in the United States, saying that President Trump's policies could make things even worse.
The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, has just finished a 2-week tour of the US, which has the world's richest economy. But out of a population of 323 million, more than 40 million Americans live in poverty. Julian Marshall asked Mr. Alston more about his findings.
When you go around the country and actually see the extent of neglect, when you discover that people have, for example, no possibility of getting access to dental care short of being taken to an emergency room to have an extraction, that the possibility of getting in to see a doctor is virtually impossible for a great many of these poor people, you start to get a deeper sense of how problematic it is that the welfare system is so deeply inadequate.
But for many people, an inability to get access to dental or medical care would not necessarily fall within their definitions of poverty or extreme poverty.
Well, it's a very interesting cycle, in fact. So what happens is that your teeth start decaying, your breath starts smelling, a few teeth start falling out, you become unemployable. You then find that you then can't earn a living, you don't have the money to be able to afford dental care, and it's a downward spiral.
What about a lack of access, for instance, to proper sanitation, which would more broadly fit into a person's definition of poverty?
That is a major problem. In 2 of the states that I visited, Alabama and West Virginia, I realized that government-provided sewerage systems are available in urban areas only, and that in the great majority of the state there is no such provision. The authorities, when I asked them what their plans were to expand coverage, they said, we don't have any. It's up to individuals. But in some of those states, particularly Alabama, where the ground is very hard, it can cost something like $30,000 to install a septic tank. And the result is that you have what they call straight piping, which means that the effluent runs from a pipe out of the house into the garden, basically, and forms cesspools.
Would you not agree, though, that a lot of the things that you've been talking about, lack of access to proper dental, medical care, homelessness, people on the streets, are things that you might find in most Western capitals, most cities in the developed world?
There's no question that every country has its weak spots, but you've got to keep in mind that there are 40 million people in the United States who are living below the poverty line, and that's a stunning number in one of the world's wealthiest countries, where a decision is currently being taken to transfer $1 or $1.5 billion to the wealthiest. My view is that what needs to change is the overarching terms of the debate. So what we're seeing, particularly around welfare these days, is a narrative that on the one hand the rich are virtuous and work hard, will invest, will generate profits, etc. The poor, on the other hand, are lazy, fraudulent, dirty, and this is not a criticism of the Trump administration. It's an accumulated outcome from years of different administrations. I think what's different is that the Trump administration is trying to bring about a really radical sea change in the overall policy framework, which would hugely exacerbate the problems that they've inherited rather than making them better.
UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, speaking there to NewsHour's Julian Marshall. ZANU-PF is now on a new trajectory, the words of Emmerson Mnangagwa at a special congress of Zimbabwe's governing party. It's the first such gathering since he became president last month, after Robert Mugabe resigned following a military takeover. Having taken control of the country and now formally endorsed as leader by the party, Mr. Mnangagwa is keen to draw a line under the past. He made what could turn out to be a rather big commitment.
Democracy means that as a political party, ZANU-PF must always compete for office through pitting itself against opposition parties in elections which must be credible, free, fair and transparent.
President Mnangagwa wants to show Zimbabwe and the world that the Mugabe era is well and truly over after almost 40 years. So is it? A question for the BBC's Shingai Nyoka in the capital, Harare.
Well, he would like to believe so. The clip that you played there clearly is the biggest test that will show whether he is committed to setting Zimbabwe on a new democratic path. Having said that, though, there appear to be contradictions in his statement. As he was saying that 3 former members of ZANU-PF that had been allied to Grace Mugabe were arrested and charged today simply for wearing a party regalia bearing his initials without the party permission. And so on the one hand, you have these utterances, and then on the other hand, there are indications that some of the intolerance that characterized Robert Mugabe's government is still well and alive.
If we're looking ahead to some sort of change in Zimbabwe, where does the opposition fit into this scenario?
Well, the opposition would want free and fair elections. That's the basis on which they believe that they might have a chance at being a governing party. There are so many reform conditions that they have set that they believe will level the playing field. In the past, ZANU-PF has been criticized for almost all its elections of rigging those elections, of restricting media freedoms and restricting opposition campaigners. And so this really will be a test for Emmerson Mnangagwa if he's able to deliver a voter register that's undisputed, and if he will open up voting to allow the millions of Zimbabweans living abroad, who many of whom are perceived to be allied to the opposition. If he allows them to vote, those would be real indicators that he wants to set Zimbabwe on a democratic path.
A brief word on the former President Robert Mugabe. I understand we've seen pictures of him, I believe, in Singapore.
Yes, he left for the Far East with his family and his wife a few days ago, and there appear to be credible photos of him leaving one of the Singapore hospitals that he normally frequents for his annual checkups. And the irony is that as he was looking relaxed, leaving this particular hospital, the ZANU-PF Congress was endorsing his recalling as leader and also the expulsion of his wife, Grace. So the era of President Robert Mugabe is well and truly over here in Zimbabwe.
Shingai Nyoka in Harare. The huge wildfire in the mountains north of Los Angeles has been burning for 11 days. Strong winds have returned, making it that much harder for firefighters to put out the flames. The fire already covers over 1,000 square kilometres and has destroyed hundreds of homes. Our correspondent James Cook is in Fillmore, between LA and Santa Barbara, on the eastern edges of the fire.
Well, first of all, there is smoke in the sky in almost every direction. The sun is just peeking through on one side, but looking towards the fire, I cannot even see the mountains at the moment, such is the smoke. And this extends way, way beyond me to the north and west for such an incredible area. The size of New York City and Paris combined, this fire. It's actually bigger than that now. And as you say, more than 700 homes have been destroyed already. Hundreds more have been damaged. 2 hotels have burnt down. 2 residential apartment complexes have burnt down as well. It really is having a devastating effect.
What about the scale of the firefighting operation?
Well, it's enormous. It's an enormous firefighting operation. More than 8,000, nearly 9,000 firefighters out here on the fire lines, trying to cut fire breaks for the most part, to try to arrest the movement of this blaze, particularly to try to stop it from coming down onto the coast, to the Pacific coastal towns. Perhaps half a dozen towns are threatened, including Santa Barbara, the wealthy resort town. But it is a dangerous operation, as we know, because yesterday we had the death of Corey Iverson, a 32-year-old father of a 2-year-old girl. His pregnant wife he leaves behind as well. And he died very near here in Fillmore. We've just been right up to the spot where he died. The circumstances are unclear, but there are cliffs in that area, and it seems the terrain was difficult and he may have been overcome by the flames.
James Cook in California. Egypt's Coptic Christians have become one of the most terrorized groups in the Middle East, victims of bombings, shootings and stabbings carried out by so-called Islamic State and other jihadists. Yet these descendants of the ancient Egyptians have shown remarkable resilience and forgiveness, as our security correspondent Frank Gardner found out on a visit to a monastery near Cairo.
Well, as you can hear, the whole church is echoing to the sound of prayers here. It began with Vespers, and there's now a litany being said. On one side of the church are black-clad monks, their heads wreathed in these skull caps. They're grey-bearded men, some of them, though, quite young, and in a way quite modern because they're taking selfies of each other with their mobile phones. They've come from as far away as Los Angeles. Monks are embracing each other. The Coptic Pope has just made a procession up here, clad in red and gold and silver. He's going to elevate various bishops, including the Bishop of London, the Coptic Bishop of London.
Tonight signals the birth of a new diocese, the Diocese of London.
I'm sitting down at the monastery of St. Bishoy with the new Coptic Bishop of London, His Grace Bishop Angelos.
The Copts are a resilient people. We've faced persecution for over 2,000 years. And the wonderful thing and very inspiring thing for me is that I always fall back on the example of people here who face this with such forgiveness and such strength and such grace.
But that in itself is quite controversial, isn't it? Because there is a cult of martyrdom, and some have even welcomed death at the hands of Daesh, of ISIS.
Let's get this straight. We don't want to die. We love to live because life is given to us by God. We are not people who look to die, but we embrace it if it comes our way. I think the resilience comes from a love of life in the right way and an ability to forgive even those who pursue our death and our persecution.
What would you say, though, controversially, what would you say to the extremists of ISIS and others who say Christians have no place in the Middle East?
My message to those who choose to persecute us, I put out in a statement recently saying that you are loved. We love you. We forgive you.
How on earth could you say you love somebody who butchers and blows up innocent people?
Because I know that it is the evil within the person acting, not the person, him or herself. And what I want is for that person to look at every individual as a human, with a sanctity of life, with a dignity, with a right to live.
Well, we've just negotiated our way through the chaotic Cairo traffic, and we've come to an apartment building in a part of Cairo called Shubra, and we're here to meet a Coptic man whose granddaughter, Maggie, was killed in the bombing of the Boutrasiya Cathedral in December last year.
Maggie's father went to her and found her on a trolley, plugged into a machine. We were praying for a miracle. We prayed to God to save her. We kept on praying for her. But sadly, she was gone. On the 21st of December, she went to heaven.
After the terrible thing that's happened, Samir, has it changed you? Do you feel stronger, weaker?
After the attack, we are stronger. I used to go to church once a week before the attack, but now I go several times a week. Our church is called the Martyrs' Church. Its roots grow with the blood of martyrs, the believers of the church.
Could you ever forgive the terrorists who did this?
Our religion teaches us to forgive. It teaches us to love our enemies, bless those who curse us, and to pray for those who hurt us. Yes, we will forgive them, despite all the blood that was spilled. Our faith tells us to forgive.
That report's from Egypt by Frank Gardner. According to the World Health Organization, tuberculosis killed more than 1.5 million people last year. But researchers in Tanzania, in East Africa, have found a novel way of detecting infections. They use rats, African giant pouched rats, which have a heightened sense of smell that can sniff out TB. NewsHour's James Menendez learned more from the project manager, Dr. Georges Mgode.
The rats have highly developed olfactory system. It is easy to train them on a particular target. For this case, we train them to detect tuberculosis in human sputum samples. These rats have been trained to detect specific volatile organic compounds which are unique to Mycobacteria tuberculosis. And when the rat encounter this, they will indicate that this is a positive
It takes a rat 1 second to know whether the sample is positive or negative. These samples are put in 10 samples in a row, and the rat is moving from one sample to another. So within 1 second, if a sample is negative, the rat will ignore and go to the second sample. Upon landing on a positive sample, the rat will spend 3 seconds there, pausing and sticking the nose, even sometimes scratching to show you that here is the positive.
How do you encourage them to recognise these smells? What's the reward you give them?
When the baby rat is 1 month old, the trainer start socializing with that to be friendly. Then you start training to obey a command, then to find a target. Upon finding a target, you give a reward, which is food. In this case, we have mashed banana with peanut mixed together, and you give a little bit so that it can continue working. Then it associates this food with a target that is the TB. This is how we link.
Are you able to give us a sort of broad figure of their accuracy?
Yeah, 70% up to 80. In 20 minutes, the rat can evaluate 100 to 150 samples. So 150 will take a lab technician 5 days, and this is done by the rat in 20 minutes.
Dr. Georges Mgode and the TB-sniffing rats. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. A reminder that every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter in The World This Week. It's presented this week by Janet Jalil.
After President Macron hosted a climate change summit in Paris this week and after his recent interventions in the Middle East and Africa, we'll be asking, is Mr Macron trying to make France great again? We'll also be examining what was behind the Republicans' shock defeat in the Bible Belt state of Alabama. Also on The World This Week, we'll ask, why is Google going to China to develop artificial intelligence when its search products are still blocked there? And we'll hear about how Saudis have been reacting to the lifting of a decades-old ban on cinema. We'll ask, is this just good PR for the leadership or a step towards greater freedoms for Saudis?
That's all in The World This Week, broadcast on Saturdays and Sundays and available to download from our website. FIFA threatens to bar Spain from the World Cup. Spain in danger of being kicked out. Just a few alarming headlines in the Spanish newspapers on Friday, reflecting worries that the national team could be prevented from taking part in next year's tournament in Russia. It follows an apparent warning from football's governing body, FIFA, raising concerns about alleged government interference in the running of the game in Spain. So what's the problem? I asked our sports news correspondent, Alex Capstick.
It stretches back to the election for the presidency of the Spanish Football Federation earlier this year. In May, it was won by Ángel María Villalona. And then, 2 months later, in July, Mr. Villalona was arrested by the Spanish authorities on charges of corruption. He was put in jail for a while. He's now out on bail, but he was suspended from his role as president of the federation. But since then, the Spanish government, specifically the sports ministry, has asked for a rerun of that presidential election. The federation has gone to FIFA and says we're under pressure to run these elections. FIFA said, well, that can't happen because our rules clearly state that the government can't get involved in footballing affairs. So you better be careful, because if this continues, we could suspend you. And in the case of a suspension, the ultimate sanction there is a ban from all football, and that would mean the World Cup.
This issue of third-party interference, especially governments, is something FIFA doesn't take lightly. I mean, a lot of other countries, you could call them perhaps maybe, lesser nations of international football, have really got in trouble over this.
Yes, currently Pakistan is banned from football because the government has got hold of its accounts and won't let them go. Previously, Kuwait was suspended because of government interference, and FIFA has just lifted that ban. In the past, Nigeria was banned in 2014 once the team got back from the World Cup in Brazil, where they were knocked out. The government sacked many of the executive members of the Football Federation. So yes, it has happened in the past, but not to a country like Spain with the power and the history in football that Spain has.
This is arguably the World Cup, the biggest sporting event in the world. So many people watch it, so many people are interested. FIFA have a big commitment to widening the interest in the game. could you conceive of the idea of a World Cup without Spain?
In this instance, this would be an absolutely huge, unprecedented move by FIFA. If they were to suspend a country, as I said, as powerful as Spain in the world of football, that would be absolutely massive. You know, this was a warning they've given them. It's a shot across the bows. It's not... I've spoken to people inside FIFA. They haven't written to Spain and said directly, you're in danger of missing out on the World Cup. They've been very careful. They wouldn't normally do that anyway, but they've been very careful about the way they've worded this. It's a reminder. It's a gentle warning that, look, the government's getting involved here. It's against the rules. You need to sort it out.
Alex Capstick there. To South Korea now, where the government has announced its intention to ban after-school English classes for primary school pupils. It says it wants to ease the academic burden on young children, but parents are unhappy. Some have taken to the street in protest. Our Asia-Pacific editor, Celia Hatton, gave me more details.
The problem is that the South Korean Ministry of Education has responded to sort of low-level criticism over the years that they're putting too much pressure on children, youngest children, age 8 and 9, who are just starting out in kind of formal education. And it's trying to relieve that academic burden on those children by saying, look, those children can take some after-school activities that are more geared towards having fun or learning extra skills, but they don't want those children to start studying English so early. So what the Ministry of Education has done is it's stopped state school teachers from being allowed to teach English after school. And it's trying to get those students in those age groups to take other classes, things like music or art.
There'll be some people listening to this they're parents who have kids. Their kids go to school and the children have a pretty relaxed school day. What's it like in South Korea?
It's far different in South Korea. You have to imagine the entire South Korean education system as it stands now, from when you enter in kindergarten until you graduate from high school, is geared towards one 8-hour exam you will take at the very end of high school. The mark you get in that exam will basically, in many parents' minds and children's minds, determine whether you are a success or failure in life, not just in that exam. So if you do well in the exam, you might get into a good South Korean university, go on and be offered a job, and you're kind of set for life, it's thought. South Korea has really high levels of youth suicide. In fact, suicide rates among young people have doubled in the past few years. And so many people are trying to change this system, but frankly, it really is ingrained. Parents, they put pressure on educators, who put pressure on students to spend as many as 15 hours a day studying. The average South Korean teenager gets just over 5 hours of sleep a night. The entire system kind of runs on stress. So that's why when the Ministry of Education makes a pronouncement saying, hey, look, your 8 and 9-year-olds can't study English after school anymore. We won't allow it to happen as part of the public system. You're going to have to pay for it yourself if you want it. That's when parents get really upset.
And presumably, private tuition for some families is just not an option.
In fact, South Koreans spend more money on private education than anywhere else in the world. And that's what's getting parents quite upset in this instance. They're saying, look, we're going to have to spend even more on private education. You're taking something away from us that we expect. And, you know, that's really a problem because, as you say, some families simply can't afford it, or they're trying to save up their money for when they think they'll really need private tuition in the later years when they get closer to that dreaded exam.
Celia Hatton. Finally, is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's a car, the world's first flying sports car, according to its makers. US manufacturer Samsung Motors says it hopes its Switchblade will be ready for launch in just a few months. Oliver Conway reports.
Oh, you pretty chitty bang bang, chitty chitty bang bang, we love you.
From Chitty Chitty Bang Bang to Blade Runner, flying cars have long been seen as a great fictional way of getting around. Now they may be about to take off for real. Oregon-based Samsung Motors says its Switchblade vehicle should be in the air by April. A three-wheeled car with a top speed of 160 kilometres an hour, its wings fold out from inside the bodywork and it's ready to fly, with a range of more than 700 kilometres. Company boss Sam Boesfield says it will allow drivers to beat the traffic.
In many parts of the world, there are places where it's very difficult to get in and out of cities. And a lot of those places have airports within the city. For instance, in Johannesburg, to get from Johannesburg to Pretoria, it's about a 40-mile drive, but it takes almost 3 hours. So if you're in rush hour, you're spending 6 hours of the day parked in traffic. With this, you'd be there in 20 minutes or less.
However, you will need a pilot certificate to fly it, not to mention 2 different insurance policies and access to an airport, unless you're in a country that allows planes to take off from ordinary roads. The Switchblade comes in a kit and costs $120,000, plus $20,000 more if you want the firm to help you build it. The company, though, is facing stiff competition, with rivals using helicopter-style rotors or paraglider wings. But it does have the advantage, if things go wrong, of an inbuilt parachute.
Oliver Conway. That's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address, globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Julian Keane. Thanks for listening.